Hare Krishna. This week we're continuing our overview of the second canto of Srimad Bhagavatam. I'm Braj Kishore, and my book on the subject is The Beautiful Tales of the All-Attractive, Volume 2. The second canto is relatively short, 10 chapters, and today we'll do a chapter-by-chapter overview of the main theme of each chapter. In chapter 1, Shukadeva Goswami speaks for the first time. In the whole first canto, he hasn't said a word. But now at the beginning of the second canto, he starts to speak. That's why it's the second canto. That's why it starts there. Quick summary of the backstory from Canto 1 is that there's a king who is going to die in a week. And he goes to the bank of the Ganges River and sits and waits for the sadhus to come, and then starts to ask them questions. And finally, Shukadeva Goswami comes. He asks Shuka a question. Basically, his question is, what am I supposed to do? I'm about to die. What am I supposed to do? But the way he phrases the question is, what's the most important thing for a human being to do? Not just when they're about to die, but all the time. So, at the beginning of the second canto, Shuka starts to answer. His answer is, the most important thing to do is to fix your mind on divinity by hearing and chanting about divinity, by Shravanam Kirtanam. So the king says, well, I only have 7 days left, like a little less than 7 days. I only have 7 days left to live. I have enough time to do this. Do I have enough time for this process? And Shuka replies, you have plenty of time. You have plenty of time. 7 days is enough. You can do it systematically. You can go step by step. You don't have to rush. So then the king wants to know, okay, that's awesome. What's the system? What's the step by step? And so that sets up the entire second canto. Because the entire second canto is about what's the system, what's the step by step. The entire second canto is about the first step is to fix your mind on divinity outside of you, externally. The second step is to fix your mind on divinity internally. And the third step is to fix your mind on divinity in its own context. So these three stages of hearing and chanting, these 3 stages of Shravanam Kirtana, that is the backbone of the theme of the second canto. So the first chapter will deal with the first step, divinity in the external world. The second chapter will deal with the second step, divinity in the internal world. And then you're going to get a bunch of questions and answers, and it won't be till the 7th chapter that you get divinity in its own context. So the persistent topic of the first chapter is how to see the world in a divine way. How to see God in the world, the external world. That's the first step because that's the most relevant to people. Everybody can see the external world. It's easily visible. So we should first of all learn how to see divinity in the external world. There's another reason why it's the first step, because it's purifying. It's the most purifying. Because basically the essence of impurity is to exploit. Selfish exploitation is the essence of impurity. So we currently see this world as something that we can dominate. We can control it. We can enjoy it. But if we begin to see it in the way that this first chapter describes, we'll stop feeling that way about the world. We'll start seeing it as something superior to us, which we'll have respect for and love for, rather than something inferior to us that we can control and enjoy. And that purifies our hearts and makes us qualified to go to the higher stages of hearing and chanting. So that's the first chapter. The first chapter gives you a bunch of different ways to see the external world in a divine way. Now the second chapter is about how to see divinity within oneself. This is after you become purified, you can start to meditate on the supersoul, the divinity that's the root of your own consciousness. So the second chapter has a very nice description of how to meditate upon the supersoul. And then it also has really far out, interesting, cool stuff about how the yogi dies and transmigrates to eventually attain moksha or liberation. That's the second chapter. The third chapter addresses a doubt that maybe Shuka's original answer was too narrow. He just said, well, you have to hear and chant about the divine. So fix your mind on the divine by hearing and chanting. That's what everybody should do. Maybe the doubt is maybe that's a little bit narrow. What about all these other religious processes and spiritual paths? He didn't say anything about those, apparently. So the third chapter is about that. Basically, it says that all these other spiritual paths and religious paths are quite valid for people who need them, and but their validity is how they support and enable a person to come to this stage of being able to fix the mind on the divine. So if you can just fix the mind on the divine, there's no need for any of the other paths. It's like if you're already on the roof, you don't need a ladder to get there. So that's why in the third chapter, Shukadeva Goswami has the famous verse, Akama Sarva Kama Moksha Kama Va, that anybody, no matter who they are, should just directly practice the bhakti yoga process. The bhakti yoga process means the process of linking consciousness to the divine through devotion, through emotions of love, affection. So the logic there is, since this is the goal of all paths, then just go straight to the goal and do it. Then you don't require any other path. Now the fourth chapter, it's kind of where everybody goes, wow, what a great answer. That was great. And oh no, is it over? That's kind of what the fourth chapter is. So the fourth chapter is like, well, come on, that was great. We want more. We want more. So in order to get more, Parikshit Maharaj has to ask questions. And Shukadeva Goswami says, I will answer your questions based on how Brahma answered these practically the same questions when Narada Muni asked him. And that's the fourth chapter. It's just kind of a segue between the first three and the rest. So in the fifth chapter, we get into the actual story of Brahma and Narada. So from the fifth chapter all the way to the seventh, we hear Brahma's conversation with Narada, his son. Narada asks several important questions in the fifth chapter. He wants to know, is Brahma the supreme being? He wants to know, what is the universe made of? He wants to know what's beyond the universe. And he wants to know how the universe evolved to become what it is. So Narada Muni asks these questions, and Brahma starts to answer them in chapter 5. Brahma's answers continue into chapter 6, but chapter 6 specifically focuses on the topic of how the original being was the prototype for the whole universe that evolved from it. So in a sense, the sixth chapter seems to be another description of the universal form, which was the topic of chapter 1. Chapter 1 was how to see the divinity in the universe and the external world. And it seems like, again, chapter 6 is talking about how the divine being, the original being, is connected to this external world. So the theme comes back. But now it's Brahma talking to Narada and explaining how the universe evolved. And so in chapter 6, he explains that there's like a prototype of the universe within this original being. In chapter 7, we finally come to the third stage of hearing and chanting, which is to hear and chant about divinity in its own context. Not divinity in the world or not divinity in me, but divinity itself, himself. So this chapter, chapter 7, speaks about avatars, because that's what avatars are. Avatars are a descent of divinity from his own context into our context so that we can experience his divinity. That's what an avatar is. An avatar is a descent. So you get a great list of avatars in chapter 7. Brahma is describing them to Narada Muni. The highlight of this chapter, it's really the highlight of the second canto. He gives a verse to most incarnations. Sometimes he gives 2 verses. Like I think Parshuram gets 2 verses. When he gets to Lord Ram, he gives several verses. When he gets to Krishna, he gives a lot of verses. And the way that he describes Krishna's avatar is really sweet, explaining how the sweetness and intimacy of Krishna completely overcomes the power and majesty of Godhead. The chapter 8 is a little bit like chapter 4. It's another part where we get a feeling like, oh no, this is going to end. This topic has come to a close, but we still want more. So in chapter 8, again, Parikshit Maharaj asks a lot of questions. You see, he's heard the conversation about Brahma and Narada, so that's come to an end. And now he wants more. So he has a lot of questions. Shukadev, he analyzes those questions as being into 10 different subjects. So basically, Shuka, he understands that Parikshit Maharaj is asking about 10 different things. And that lays out the foundation for the entire rest of the Bhagavatam, the rest, cantos 3 through 12. And it becomes the outline by which Shukadev Goswami will explain the Bhagavatam to Parikshit Maharaj. Now, the way that Shukadev starts answering Parikshit's questions in chapter 9 is again by going back to Brahma. Because, so he again goes back to Brahma, and he tells us the story of how Brahma originated and how he got darshan of Hari, and what was his conversation with Hari. So in chapter 9, we're going to get 4 shlokas of Hari giving knowledge to Lord Brahma. These 4 shlokas in chapter 9 are the core of what the Bhagavatam is. Shukadev Goswami will elaborate on those 4 verses throughout the rest of the Bhagavatam. So that's chapter 9. Chapter 9 is the beginning of Shukadev's answers to Parikshit Maharaj's dozens of questions in 10 subjects. And he answers by referring to Brahma's darshan with Hari. Chapter 10, the last chapter of second canto, is more or less a recap of many of the things that have already been discussed in the second canto. Because Shukadev Goswami, he's analyzed that there's 10 subjects that Maharaj Parikshit wants to know about. The first is origin, and the second is creation. So he begins to answer. In the 10th canto, he in the 10th chapter, he reiterates what has been said already in the second canto on these 2 subjects of origins and creation. So there's a lot of totally fascinating stuff there in the 10th chapter too. So that's the 10 chapters of the Bhagavatam. And week by week we'll go into detail in different cool things in each chapter. I hope you'll stick around.